name is Stephen Wong, and I will be your moderator today for this webinar on critical transportation issues in wildfires. I am a recent PhD graduate from the University of California, Berkeley, where my research has focused on evacuations from large-scale natural disasters. I'm actually transitioning into a role as a research and development engineer at the UC Institute of Transportation Studies, also known as UCITS, and the California Resilient and Innovative Mobility Initiative, also known as CA-RIMI. So on behalf of UCITS and CA-RIMI, we welcome you to this exciting webinar. Today, you'll be hearing from two researchers, Kenichi Soga and Mikhail Chester from UCITS, on their recent work on wildfire evacuations and post-wildfire debris flow. In both cases, transportation and its associated infrastructure play a pivotal role in ensuring safe and viable travel. Next slide, please. Briefly about UCITS. UCITS is an expansive network of faculty, research, and administrative staff and students dedicated to advancing the state-of-the-art in transportation engineering, planning, and policy to benefit the residents of California, the nation, and the world. Established by the California legislature in 1947, the UCITS has branches at UC Berkeley, UC Davis, UC Irvine, and UCLA. Next slide, please. The UCITS Statewide Transportation Research Program, which these research projects will be coming from, is supported by the state of California through the funding from the Road Repair and Accountability Act of 2017 and the Public Transportation Account. Next slide. One of the unique and most recent initiatives funded by SB1 is CA-RIMI. An initiative of UCITS, CA-RIMI serves as a living laboratory, bringing together university experts, policymakers, public agencies, industry stakeholders, and community leaders to inform the transportation system's immediate COVID-19 response and recovery needs while establishing a long-term vision and pathway for directing innovative mobility to develop sustainable and resilient transportation in California and the United States. So just a few housekeeping items before we launch into actually a couple polls please post any questions you have in the Q&A section. If you have any technical questions or difficulties, please post them for the hosts in the chat section. So we're going to start with a few polls to get everyone oriented. If you could launch the first poll. Not seeing the poll come up. All right, looks like we aren't able to get the poll up right now, but we might actually, oh, there we go. Actually, there we go. So if you could please vote on the category that best describes your current workplace, this allows the presenters to kind of get an understanding of where everyone is coming from. All right, so let's see the results. Great. So a lot of people coming from academia, but we see a lot on local government. Great representation from the state legislature, some from the private sector as well as nonprofit. Great. This should help formulate some of your policies from the panelists. So on to the next poll. So this is to get everyone oriented on what we'll be talking about today. Since 2017, in the last 4 years, approximately how many total people have been ordered to evacuate from wildfires in California? All right, let's see the responses for this. Great, looks like 1.4 million was the big answer, and that is the correct one. 1.8, but we're starting to get there in 2020. So as you can see, millions of people are being ordered to evacuate from wildfires in California, which makes this a really critical issue. And then on to the last poll. Great. In 2020 alone, approximately how many acres in California have burned from wildfires? Of course, this is an approximate number, and we'll probably get final numbers from CAL FIRE in January or February. All right, let's see the results on this one. Great. Looks like 3 million, 4 million, and 5 million were the most high here. The correct answer is 4 million and counting. We're probably approaching 4.5 at this point. But as you can see, this has been one of the worst years for acreage burned in California state history. So with that orientation, I want to first introduce our first speaker today, which is Dr. Kenichi Soga. Dr. Soga, if you would like to get everything set up. Dr. Soga is the Donald H. McLaughlin Professor and a Chancellor's Professor at the University of California, Berkeley in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering. He is also a faculty scientist at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. And Dr. Soga, the floor is now yours, so go ahead.
Stephen, thank you very much for your kind introduction. Can you hear me?
Yes, you are loud and
Thanks.
clear.
Thanks. So today I'm going to talk about critical transportation issues in wildfires in related to cases of paradise in Bolinas. So I'm Kenichi Soga. This particular project will involve Professor Louise Comfort. She is a former director of the Center of Disaster Management at the University of Pittsburgh, and now she lives in Oakland. She's been living in Oakland for 30 years, so for many, many years. So she's with us, and I think she's in the audience. Professor Thomas Mariorana from UC Davis. He is a professor in the Department of Design. And Bingyu Zhao is our transportation simulation expert. And then we have students, Paula, Sena, Ko-chan, Yanlang, and Millard, who've been involved in this particular project, which is supported by ITS and Center for Information Technology Research in the Interest of Society, which is CITRIS at UC Berkeley. So just to give you a little bit of overview of what I'm going to talk about, and as Stephen mentioned in the questionnaire poll, many people are involved in terms of evacuation. So we want to talk about everything starts from local, but then there's a relationship to a region and mega regions. So I call it micro to macro, local to region to mega regional. And at the same time, we will try to show you the interaction of the fire, communication, traffic interactions in this particular presentation. And that will
Kenichi,
be
one second. We can't see your slides.
Oh, is that right?
There might be a share screen issue.
Okay, let me try again.
I want to try to see.
I'm very sorry. Yeah. Thank you very much for reminding me that.
Of
so
course.
Just to give you the names, and then can you see my slides now?
Yep, you're good to go now.
Okay, sorry. I'm very sorry about this. So my sort of a presentation will involve micro to macro, which links to local, to regional, to mega regional, and also fire, communication, traffic interactions. And this involved in our research is what we call digital twin, which involves simulations of fire, sort of water network simulation, traffic simulations, and communication simulations, not only at the local scale, but goes to the regional scale like Bay Area scale. And today I would like to talk about how it can be used for preparation and recovery, and it's scalable from local to regional. We've been looking at campfire since November 8th when it happened. And if you want to know the details, Louise and our colleagues wrote a paper called Collective Action in Communities Exposed to Recurring Hazards in terms of campfire. And you can get the report from here. But what I want to show you is this particular video is the simulation of the wildfire that happened. So the wildfire happened at 6 o'clock-ish. And then you can see that by sort of 8 o'clock, oops. So this is 7 o'clock. And then as you go along by the 8 o'clock, you start to see, oh, I'm very sorry. I'm not sure why it's going. So by 8 o'clock, you see the fire is approaching paradise. And you'll see in the next hour and a half that you'll see over here, it's going to propagate into paradise very quickly. So think about while you're in this particular seminar for 1 hour, your fire is coming and then overwhelming you. So the fire is coming, this is 8:30. And then within 1 hour, it sort of exposed everything into paradise. And then it went across the paradise and went downstream. So the speed of the fire was really, really fast on that particular one. And this is what happened after when we visited the sites. One of the transportation issues, this is 11 o'clock, so about 3 hours after evacuation being asked, and this is the middle of the sort of paradise. And of course they had this evacuation plan, but then evacuation plan could not be enforced because the fire was going so fast. So everybody had to evacuate in once. And you can see a traffic congestion over here, but at the same time, there was a traffic congestion right around here, which is Skyway, and coming into Chico, and there were 3 traffic lights really affected the traffic jam going along the Skyway. And also cell phone network went down at 10:15, and that is one of the issue in terms of communication. And then there was a county level traffic congestions, which up to 2 p.m. So it took about 5+ hours to evacuate. These are simulations that we've been trying to understand what really happened that particular day. The assumption is that there's 1.85 vehicles per household that use, meaning that some people use 1 or 2 or 3 vehicles. And then 50% of people moved in first hours, and then 40%. And when you can do a simulation, traffic simulation in terms of local, but then you can go up to the regional scale. And as you go along, you can see that at 1.5 hours, you see a sort of a traffic jam developing on that Skyway that we see what happened in that particular day. But once you see that particular simulations, you start to get a confidence. What are possibility? What if things happened in a different ways? So let's say if everybody immediately, without packing things up, but just leave everything and then leave, you can see the green line over here, which allows you to evacuate much faster. If it's phased and all leave into, it goes like this. But the actual thing that we simulated is this pink line, which is shown over here. So obviously people packing things up using different vehicles did delay things and then comes over here. But then at the same time, if you look at here, there were some people in our simulation showing some sheltering where 100 people had to pay shelter because the alternative route was too long. And then you can start to do different kind of simulation. If you only use 1 vehicle per household, then it will be much easier for the people to evacuate. And then, of course, the number of vehicles are smaller because you're only using smaller number of cars, but then it's much easier to evacuate, but then also there's a less traffic jam. And also you can look at how many people were in the gridlock or how many people were in fire. If the roads were all closed because the fire came and tree falling down, of course, you'll see a lot of people exposed to fire. But then looking at like 2 vehicles per household, if everybody were using 2 vehicles, it will have been worse, but it was 1.85. But if you use only 1 vehicle, it could have been better. And these are the simulations that we can tell what could have been done if it's in that particular situation. Let's go to Bolinas. Luis was in contact with Bolinas. You may know Bolinas is the north of San Francisco. It's a small town over here, and we start to get engaged with them, looking at community level engagement of wildfire evacuation. And if you see the Bolinas over here, you see the residents living over here. And then if you look at the road network, there are not much escape route. There's only 1 way that goes along here, which you can go to the south or go to the north. And if you look at the sort of a Google map image, there's a residential area, and then this is called Big Mesa. And if you look at the roads, there are narrow unpaved roads in the residential areas. And then if you go to the evacuation route, you have this road, but you have eucalyptus trees, which is not good for the fire. And then as you may know very well, Bolinas has a nice beach. So tourists come during the weekends, and that becomes a huge increase in population, and they stay around this particular area. So we were looking at different scenarios. For example, scenario 1 is a small fire within the 10-mile radius of Bolinas. So you can see the fires are developing really close to Bolinas. And in this case, we assume that cell towers are operating. You have 100% communication through your cell phones. And then 1,500 residents can communicate with one another. But scenario 2 is that there's a bigger fire, a little bit 25 miles radius of Bolinas. And then at the same time, there's a smaller one which you have to evacuate. But then in this case, the fire crews around this area has to focus on this one, so you get less people supporting Bolinas. So wood care station can send engines but take about 30 minutes. But then we assume that cell tower is damaged, and then 50% don't have a cell service. And then the scenario 3 is much bigger fire that we saw this year. Is a big fire on the north, and then there's a smaller fire in Bolinas. In this case, we assume that the cell towers are down, or in other words, you don't get a cell calls. And you can start doing what we call communication modeling, which Louise and my student did, and really time to inform all residents in Bolinas after fire starts. And then in this particular case, it may take about 1.4 hours. In this case, it's 4 hours. In this case, 6.5 hours, because the cell towers are down. Cell communication is down. And this sort of shows the potential way to communicate to people to say to evacuate. And then, of course, fire police radios, ham radios can give you much faster response. But then cognitive, just seeing the fire and then and move is another, but it's be slower. And then door-to-door communication becomes worst case. And scenario theory is when the cell tower is cell service not available, so you have 0 over here, and then more cognitive and door-to-door communication becomes important. And this becomes part of our traffic simulation. So in this particular case, if you have a fire in Bolinas, we assume there are 3 different scenarios within Bolinas. One is happening over here, fire 1, this is fire scenario 2, and fire scenario 3. And then fire propagates in a different way. And this is shown over here, is that fire 1 scenario will come fire going this way from the west to the east, which allows people to move this way. But if you're a fire over here, fire will go down, and then it will go counter against where they want to evacuate. And then these are the interesting simulation that we can do with the fire propagating and people communicating and doing the agent-based model of the traffic and how people evacuate. So let's look at fire scenario 1. Fire scenario 1 is coming from the west to east. And in this particular case, actually, because residents recognize the fire quickly so they can evacuate, and they do, even with a different cell communication, they can evacuate. Of course, cell communication 0 will give you later sort of a movement, but they will have a good, but the problem is the visitors don't have a cell communication. So in that case, they don't know fire is coming. So it'll be very difficult for them to evacuate, and therefore they may get trapped into the fire. And that's what you see over here, is that in fire scenario 1, visitors will have a problem. On fire scenario 2, when fire comes from the east to west, then you can start to see that residents who over here have a more difficulty, and that communication becomes important. So if the cell communication is good, it's good evacuation. But then if the cell communication is 0, then it'll be difficult for the residents to understand where it's going. And therefore you have a less evacuation, and then they get trapped into the fire. And this one shows the sort of a scenario 2 and the development of the fire, which is shown in sort of a reddish one. And then the purple lines are showing where the traffic get jams. And then if cell communication is 100, people can evacuate quickly before the fire propagates. But in communication 0, it takes time. So you start to have a traffic jam and within the fire. So just a little bit of summary is that if you don't have any congestion, no fire, if you just want to go out of Bolinas, it will probably take about average of 18 to 25 minutes. But if you start in terms of wildfire condition, if you have 1 vehicle per household, then it will probably take about 28. But if you start using 2 vehicles per household, then it will take 43 minutes. And then if you have 2 households plus the visitors, then it becomes 48 minutes if you have a cell communication 100%. But then if the cell communication start to go down to 50 to 0, then that start to change. And this one shows the sort of after 2 hours, how many have evacuated, and then how many haven't really started. So when you see a cell communication 100, yes, you can have a good people evacuating. But then if the cell communication becomes zero, then some are evacuated because they've seen the fire, but then there's still people left inside the Bolinas because they don't know, they haven't seen the fire, and then they haven't started after 2 hours. So there's a delay in communication, which allows difficult people to evacuate. So this allows us to start looking at different types of understanding the local knowledge, which is always the important part. So we're having a game, and Professor Thomas is working on developing a game to really get the local knowledge, and then trying to do our simulation to understand how the traffic is going. And then people will understand what are the evacuation possibilities. And then these are some of the games that we're creating, digital games that we're creating with our colleagues, and trying to see what we can use these sort of digital technology to get used to how to evacuate, and more about evacuation preparedness. So possible takeaway for today is that I showed you about digital twin, combining simulation of fire, communication, water supply, and traffic, really looking at local, regional, and mega regional interaction. And then local knowledge is very important. And I said that the devil is in the details, but then it allows us to do stress testing, simulation for preparation and recovery. So in terms of preparation, it's really important of communication. And then we start to realize that there needs to be an alternative robust communication mode when the cell tower is down. And that leads to road accessibility and the possibility of evacuation, but also thinking about sheltering. In recovery, it's about infrastructure resilience. And so linking water, communication power is important. And there's an issue that my colleagues were going to talk about, I believe, about role of transportation for road access, for relocation, which is always about where's your house, job, and school. Finally, I just want to talk about role of emerging technologies that I show a little bit of gaming that we're working on, but it's community network development is very important to ensure that community work together to evacuate and work together for recovery. And then there are new sensors coming out to give the more information that will help the digital twin to do better action during the evacuation and recovery. That's all I have. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much, Kenichi. Just a reminder for everyone to please post your questions in the Q&A, and we will get to it later in the webinar. So we are now going to move into our second presentation from Dr. Mikhail Chester. Dr. Chester was a visiting scholar and professor at UCLA's Institute of Transportation Studies and Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering in 2019 and 2020. He is currently an associate professor in the School of Sustainable Engineering and the Built Environment at Arizona State University. We are going to turn it over to Dr. Chester, and the floor is now yours.
Thanks, Stephen. Stephen, can you hear me okay and see the slides?
Yes, you are good to go.
Great, thank you, folks. So a little bit of background here. I was fortunate enough to go on sabbatical to UCLA last year, where I developed this study on post-wildfire debris flows and roadway vulnerability. A lot of the modeling work I want to mention was done, and a lot of the sort of interpretation was done by my graduate student, Ray Lee. So she was integral to the development of this. Part of the motivation here sort of stems back probably about 5 years ago, when I started, maybe a little longer than that, when I started looking at the intersection of climate change hazards and infrastructure. And when I say infrastructure, I mean, big gray stuff, roads and power lines and water and so on. And at the time, I felt somewhat displeased with the level of rigor with how we sort of dissected this word or applied this word vulnerability. The term was often used in a pretty sort of bland way. Often what we were talking about when we talked about climate change and infrastructure was this idea of, we've got some hazard, it could be extreme heat, it could be wildfires, it could be coastal surges or sea level rise or inland flooding. And we would take those forecasts and overlay them on top of infrastructure. And we would look at that infrastructure and we would say, where we have more of the hazard, we would say the infrastructure is vulnerable, right? And we in my research lab sort of took a step back and said, okay, let's think a bit more critically around this. First off, when we look at sort of where the hazard is and what infrastructure are there, there's this concept of failure that becomes important. And often when we think about failure as a catastrophe, right? Like total failure of the asset, like the roadway getting washed away, something like that. But more often than not, probably 99% of the time, I mean, it's happening right now as we speak, failure of infrastructure due to climate change is something far more subtle, and it's sort of creeping up on us. It's taking a long time to happen. So when we talk about a roadway and for example, extreme heat or temperature rise, it might be cracking of the road. And that cracking happens more and more and more. And over time, it reaches a point where we say we have to resurface the road, right? Now that problem is far less sexy, but generally, that is the sort of predominance of failure modes when we're talking about climate change. However, there's of course the extremes, right? So there's this pretty large magnitude event that brings the asset to failure. But even in that case, what does failure mean? Are we talking about the total wiping out of that asset, or are we talking about it losing function? So, right away, I'll bring up the question of, in a wildfire, does the road burn away? No, generally it doesn't, right? So what are we talking about when we talk about vulnerability of roads to wildfire? So it didn't take long for us to dig into this question, first in Arizona, but the work here during my sabbatical focused on the entire state of California, sort of improving the model and extending it across the entire state. It didn't take long for us to identify, sort of the real culprit here, and that is post-wildfire debris flows. So I am not saying that wildfires are insignificant in what they mean for the roadway. They certainly are, particularly as we just heard in the context of evacuation. But when we talk about wildfires and the concurrency of precipitation events that happen afterwards, which in California is fairly common, you have a particularly nasty set of circumstances. So let me give you some context there. So, we basically wanted to develop some rigor around what it means for a road to be vulnerable in the face of post-wildfire debris flows. And it turns out that, if you look at the field of geology, probably a bunch of other fields, there's a rich history of trying to understand the context, the severity, the sort of characteristics of of debris flows, and often of post-fire debris flows. So that community has spent, literally four or 5 decades working on this topic, looking at fire risk, geology, vegetation, soil conditions, soil slope, all sorts of things to come up with some, very usable information about, what the risk is of a post-fire debris flow after a fire has come through. And just to give you guys some context, the magnitude of post-fire debris flows can be orders of magnitude. It's not unrealistic to expect the flow to be 100 times worse than pre-fire flow conditions. So meaning if you had a rain event before the fire where the vegetation was intact, the soil was more stable, things like that, the soil chemistry was pre-fire, you would get a flow intensity of a certain amount, but after the fire, it could be literally 100 times larger, right? That's what you're up against. And of course, as that moves towards the roadway, the question becomes, are the roads, able to deal with that flow? And I think it's really important to ask, what are we actually talking about when we say deal with the flow? Are we talking about overtopping? So where the road itself might be intact, but you have water or debris running over the top of it. Does it wipe out the road? It might run into a culvert and take the culvert out that goes underneath the road, taking the roadway with it. So there's a number of different failure mechanisms to think about. We don't quite get there in this work, but set the stage for that. So first major point I think I've already made here, which is this idea that our thinking needs to shift. And this represents a far more difficult, but far more meaningful interpretation from hazard to vulnerability. So again, this idea that, as you have a fire going through a region, the road might be usable. Of course, evacuations are a totally different story. The road might be usable, but the post-fire conditions when you have a debris flow mean something very different. So to us, vulnerability means something very different than, again, overlaying the hazard on top of the infrastructure. So we set about the work, and I don't have time in the 15 minutes that we have here to really dig into the methods. And my technical advisory committee members were integral. We had a number of folks from Caltrans and California Geologic Survey and a number of other agencies that really helped us improve the work, improve the interpretation, and so on. But in general, what we are doing is taking both today as well as future conditions. You'll see very soon that the uncertainty in future conditions represents one of the computational challenges here. But we take variables associated with soil, vegetation, topography, as well as fire risk and precipitation to come up with a model of sort of a post-fire debris flow likelihood model that gives us sort of a baseline reference point before we sort of overlay transportation infrastructure in. So in general, we start by evaluating current conditions, and then we fast forward using CalAdapt data, particularly the CAN-ESM2 and HADGEM models, which you can see what they represent down there. They don't produce radically different results, but we look at both 4.5 and 8.5, and I think it's really important to interpret between those two and ask what that means. So that's sort of where we start. And we take, as I mentioned before, lots of really useful models that have already been developed by the USGS as well as the geology community around post-fire debris flow risk. And some of these models have actually been calibrated against or with California data. So that actually becomes, to our advantage here. We've tried to apply the models elsewhere, and obviously that creates some uncertainty. So that is the basis for the work. For my TAC members that might be on the phone, and for those who will take a look at the final report, we're already, kind of 6 months beyond kind of innovating where we left off when the report was written. So the results that you're going to see today represent slightly different outcomes than what's published there in that technical report. So second major point that I want to raise is the idea of climate unevenness. And I'd like to make this point because I think it's really, really important when we think about decision making. So climate change in California or pretty much anywhere else in the United States or the world does not show, for the most part, homogeneous increases in extreme events everywhere. Matter of fact, it generally shows that extreme events get worse in some places and less severe in others. So you can see that here for basically fire risk or burn area on the left and for precipitation on the right. So in some places, more extreme precip events, more extreme wildfires or burned area, and vice versa, right? And that's kind of the red and the blue, which flip legends or scales between those figures. So why do I bring this up? Because that actually introduces significant complexity to how we think about this problem. If I were to say to you, climate change makes extremes worse everywhere, we have a single set of decision-making reference points to work around. But if I say to you, it gets worse in some places and better in others, then it becomes a much more complicated problem to deal with. And as you guys can hopefully see, you kind of have to put those two figures together. So, precip getting worse and wildfire risk getting worse. Okay, that's one thing. But what about situations where precip gets worse, but fire risk gets better? What does that mean? What's the net result? So we did that work. So the results. There are so many scenarios that we could consider. That's part of the challenge, both in terms of communication of the results, but also in terms of computation. And I don't want to underestimate that and make that clear to you guys, how difficult it can be to model computationally the permutation of, the uncertainty bounds across so many different variables. So for example, this is showing a 15-minute rain event. We could model a 30-minute, a 60-minute, a 6-hour, a 12-hour, a 24-hour, and we've done some of that. I've already talked about models 4.5 and 8.5 in terms of climate scenarios, RCPs, right? So we can look at both of those across different climate models that different national labs or other agencies have developed. We can look at a number of different variables, the probability of failure, what's our reference point? So what we're showing here is for a 15-minute intensity or 15-minute event, establishing a normative 50% chance that you will have failure, that you will have a post-fire debris flow. I need to be specific. What we see is that at this 10-year event, about 0.53% of roadways in California have a 50% chance of experiencing a debris flow. If we go to a 100-year event, then that goes to about 10% of roadways in the current case that are likely to experience a deep debris flow. In the future, at that 10-year event, we would expect this percentage to go from 0.53 to 1.7 to 10.4. And I think it's important to actually interpret, through this lens. So, not getting lost in the decimal points, which you quickly get lost in, but instead to say, what's the relative change? And the relative change is huge. You're basically looking at a 3 to, 20 times difference in the likelihood of a debris flow. And of course, that varies across regions, which is what you're seeing on the right over there. Generally on the map on the right, the darker the region, it means that the lower intensity and therefore more frequent events are likely to trigger a debris flow. And as you'll see in the results by Caltrans district in a minute here, that generally conforms to where we would expect debris flows to happen, but I'll talk a little bit about what the significance of that is. So I just showed you debris flow likelihood. Now let me talk about roadways, correct? Because we haven't yet put them together. So one of the challenges is when you want to understand the criticality of roads, your default often is, let's look at traffic. And that makes a lot of sense, of course, but there's a few problems with that. The first is that we don't have traffic data everywhere. And a lot of the places where you would expect fires and debris flows are pretty remote areas. Hence, they don't have traffic data, but they are remote in general. Does that mean they're not important if they have little traffic or we don't have traffic data on them? No, they might actually serve a really critical link between a community and, let's say, a hospital, right? Or, as we just heard in the last presentation, being able to evacuate. So we instead choose to frame the roadway context or the infrastructure context based on measures of network connectivity. In particular, we use a measure called betweenness centrality. And to put it simply, that's measuring how important in a roadway network each link is, meaning how non-substitutable it is. If I take that link out, then a lot of travel is going to have to reroute. And I think a useful way to kind of look at the importance of links in the network. And what we do is we take that measure of betweenness centrality and we join it up with the debris flow risk that I just showed you. And the resulting outcome is this. Now by Caltrans district, so we were trying to speak to where sort of a certain level of governance around decision making might happen, districts 1 through 12. And you can kind of see visually on the left as you go from current to future, things get more dense, right? There's a lot more debris flow and corresponding wildfires that happen. But what you see on the right there is a table that ranks based on the number of points in any one of those current or future scenarios, which districts have the worst outcomes. Those would be the ones, the darker colors, and which have the best. So what you should do when you look at this table is try to look for differences between the current and the future. So for example, here, ranked 4th worst, but then becomes 7th worst, right? So it actually gets a little bit better. But in certain places you go from where it's less bad to more bad, right? So here you have an 8 and it goes to a 4. So that might be a useful way to think about how we might allocate resources in the future, or in general think about where we need to focus our attention in terms of how we design for the future. So last point I want to leave you with is the idea of safe to fail. So what's important to recognize is when you look at this figure and you're seeing dots go from, as I told you before in the percentages, right, upwards of, 3 to 10 times the number of debris flows. And, here you have the roads that are being intersected by that. You might say, can we keep up? Is it possible to keep up with this? And the answer might simply be no. I'm not saying throw your hands up and basically concede. No, absolutely not. But I think the reality is that the climate is changing faster than our ability to affect change in infrastructure. Infrastructure are rigid, they're meant to be there for a long time. There are a lot of them are underfunded, a lot of assets are underfunded and in a state of disrepair. You got lots of problems in the current context. And now we have to somehow rehabilitate this massive network for the future. And I think that there is a reality that some of that rehabilitation is absolutely possible and should be kind of, we should come up with ways, which, we're trying to do here, is sort of surgically investing limited resources to hotspot areas. But there will be a lot of areas where, failure will happen. Failure is inevitable. Now, does that mean that we accept loss of life or, major economic damage? No, there are smart ways to deal with that. And one of those ways is called safe to fail. So here's an example in the Netherlands where you had basically coastal surge resulting in river surge. And a particular region had a choice. We could build a lot of levees to hold that river surge back. And that's really expensive, both in terms of capital and long run upkeep. Or we could let the river in. We could basically give it space when it needs space. And that land that gets flooded, actually, we're going to allow farmers to use that land for agriculture. We won't allow critical services there, of course. But we'll allow farmers to use that land. And when flooding happens, they'll lose their crops, but we'll reimburse them for those losses. And the reimbursing them for the loss every once in a while is far less than building up levees, trying to hold back that river, far less. And you see lots of examples of this actually on the water side. You don't see that many examples on the wildfire side. And I think it's a strategy that's worth considering, not simply letting nature in, but more so incorporating failure into design. Thinking as we design roads or adaptation, what happens when failure occurs? What happens when we reach surprise? What happens when we surpass the design envelope? The report here, is publicly available. Data on an interactive map from the report are available at wildfires.resilientinfrastructure.org. And we're in the process of, refining, improving. If you give it academics time, they'll just keep improving the model. So that's what we've been doing. So that journal publication will hopefully be written soon. And thank you all for your attention and interest.
Great, thank you so much. That was fantastic. We are going to be moving into a really unique opportunity to hear feedback and reactions from Lisa Worthington. Lisa Worthington is a senior landscape architect at the California Department of Transportation, also known as Caltrans, in the Office of Emergency Management in the Division of Maintenance. She serves as the main point of contact for Caltrans for wildfire mitigation and post-incident response. So she's going to be providing a brief reactions and perhaps how these different research projects could be helpful for Caltrans, as we just saw in that last presentation. Thank you so much. Go ahead, Lisa.
Thank you. This was really fun to be invited to be a panelist and to provide some sort of technical or critical response or reaction to the research. Really appreciated the way it was laid out with a lot of graphic explanation to sort of stitch together the technical and then the practical. Why I accepted this invitation to be a panelist is because the researchers told me that this research is practice oriented and that they were looking for feedback that informs decision making and potentially leads to new legislation for enhanced response to these critical issues in the transportation framework. really great way to pull policy into action using research-based information. So really, really great. Thank you. First, I'd like to talk about the first research that was shown. My reaction was comfortable until you started using the term gaming. When I think about the work that I do, perhaps integrated in an emergency management way with others, gaming scenarios and animation does not come up to the top of the list. Maybe it's because gaming has always been equivocal to fun. And when I think about evacuation planning or rehearsal, there's always an underlying sense of tension there. And in real life, it becomes that adrenaline rush. But I flipped that around and I thought, okay, you know, in this new normal, as you've described, putting a lot of the models into a game-like format, will that help us get comfortable with scenarios or options that are 10 times or 100 times greater than the worst case scenario that we have experienced to date, but may be more likely in our future. And that's where I shifted and I changed in response to the gaming framework or tool set that you had shown. So I think there needs to be a little more psychology with regard to that we work through to make that palatable. I know what I witnessed myself when I was evacuated, but also in communities that were evacuating is a paralysis. People had this hesitancy. They were trying to protect the people in their homestead. They didn't know necessarily what to do without some hard thinking. So I think gaming can help with rehearsal of protocols. But then if there's a Semper Gumby attitude, and I did not coin that phrase, I have to credit former CAL FIRE unit chief Dave Hawks from the Butte unit, who was integral in the campfire and campfire response and emergency evacuation. He, in a post-fire briefing, he used that term Semper Gumby, the importance to be always flexible when you're clicking into action. So that's my response to the very first research. Any immediate reaction to my reaction on that with regard to that?
Oh, Lisa, thank you very much for your comments. That's really useful. And maybe the word gaming may shock people, so I apologize for that. But the idea was that the game is about community buildup. It's not just one people playing the game. We want community to play the games together to develop a community coherence of that you can share each other and then help each other during evacuation or something like that. So it's really about community buildup of what we are trying to do with this particular game that we wanted to do. But at the same time, there's so many local knowledge that we don't know. And that's always the issue, as I said, is that when we do simulation, you can do macro simulation, but then eventually these small things start to creep up. And we want to gather that information as much as we can through this exercise. So the idea of maybe we should change the name of game to something else that makes things better. But it's really about, for me, community build up to prepare for the evacuation. Your thoughts are very, very useful. Thank you very much.
That's a great response, Stephen. And so I think to round out that statement of the intent, it is to release the paralysis that an individual or a community might feel through frequent scenario, role playing perhaps. That I think if you release that paralysis, suddenly people click into action. The adrenaline rush helps them follow the direction from fire and law much better. So thank you for that interactive
thank you very much for
there.
rephrasing that way, because that's exactly what we want to happen. Yes.
Yeah, I can hear that and your intent. So with regard to the second research, that was provided, Mikhail, I was thinking a lot about the connection of the road infrastructure. And what was missing, I saw, was the infrastructure pulls people, the road infrastructure pulls people from zones. And what has seemed to be very inconsistent in California is the designation of zones and zone-based planning in a standard way. We might be rehearsing the public routes to use for primary and secondary evacuations. For example, if your primary route is blocked, what's your second evacuation route? But that zone that people are being pulled from, I think to inform policy, we definitely need a single state agency to manage an evacuation road network in a geospatial way that connects local, state, and federal roads to zones. That would be a big gain for California. And you mentioned that we don't have a lot of information in remote areas with regard to average daily traffic. So the state highway system, Caltrans, does have a wealth of information on the average daily traffic and even the type of that traffic. I mean, we can parse it to what is freight and what is personal auto and multimodal. I mean, we can get into rail and aviation and pedestrian and bicycle travel too, and parse all that type of transportation out. And I know this was focused mostly on vehicular and with examples given for Caltrans, but because all emergencies are local, they all originate in one localized place. And then that local emergency grows in its dependency for protection of life and property to the interconnectedness of the local to the state to the federal networks. I think it's really important to say that not only do we need to know what we don't know, but we also need to gather as much information as we can from Caltrans. The average daily traffic from all routes is known. I'd like to make sure you have access to that, and that we are very equitable. As a department, we treat remote and rural areas equal to a population center like Los Angeles in terms of the need to evacuate. So disadvantaged communities, those that are remote geospatially, or those that may have communities with a higher population of those over 65, or with disabilities, or perhaps multilingual households where they speak multiple languages. You know, we're really moving towards making sure that we're making equitable decisions. So I just wanted you to emphasize somehow, perhaps, that equity plays a part in evacuation, and that equity considerations should be part, making sure that there might be some extra measures, I should say, that we need to take for evacuating folks in those disadvantaged or remote areas of the state. Assembly Bill 747 requires all 58 counties to update their safety element in their general plan, specifically their local hazard mitigation plan, in order to identify primary and secondary emergency evacuation routes. Caltrans, so that would handle the local road network part there. Caltrans should be looking at merging a data layer that builds from that. And so that would be policy legislation that I would recommend that we have this phase 2 to AB 747. So I would just recommend that you inform a little bit more about that recent legislation. And then another thing that we're doing, and that I know it's not in your research, and I don't know if it has a place there, but how do we reduce wildfire risk? So one of the critical issues in transportation is the frequency of ignitions that start along the road network. And so if we can reduce the number of ignitions, then we can reduce, then therefore, those bigger, more catastrophic level fires from starting along the road being so critical for getting people out, but if that road was actually the source of the ignition. And what happens along roads, of course, as we know, it could be a backfiring of an engine, it could be the chain of a trailer being dragged and sparking along the road. It could be a cigarette or a tobacco product being thrown out of the window unintentionally so, or a flare that rolls through a wind event from a hazard area into the roadside vegetation. So we're really working on looking at reducing wildfire risk and the frequency of ignitions and what we can do better with pre-fire planning and prescriptive fuels reduction in those high fire risk areas. So what would your reaction be, Mikhail, to some of my comments?
Yeah, Lisa, great, thank you. Love it. You know, you hit a lot of things that I think are really important. So, you know, there's the fundamental question that we tried to shed some light on, which is, what does vulnerability mean for roads and wildfires or post-fire debris flows? And that's sort of where we are. And then there's, the point that you brought up, and this sort of came up in the Q&A, there's, you know, issues of, well, does fire risk have to be so bad? Does, you know, how do we prioritize, you know, how do we equitably deal with evacuations when wildfires are happening? And that's not something that we're touching at all. But you could imagine that our data or the information that we provide might be useful in helping to inform some of those questions. So absolutely, you know, somebody in the Q&A asked, well, is equity considered? And I said, no, but you could imagine considering equity in what we did, right? So it's not simply risk of post-fire debris flow and, you know, some sort of characteristic about the infrastructure, the roadway network, but also some characteristics about the population, about, you know, equity, about social vulnerability, about access to critical services, including healthcare when these events are happening. So absolutely. And then another point that you mentioned, in, you know, and I sort of been thinking about it as, you know, kind of how does Caltrans or state agencies in general, you know, think about changing to be able to deal with, you know, the future challenges of, you know, whatever behavior these fires are showing, or, you know, the network is doing, and so on. You know, you know, I like to bring up the example in Arizona that the Department of Transportation and our, you know, state forestry agencies have pooled funding that they sort of put money together, and then they put their heads together because now they have incentive to do that. And they ask questions like, you know, does it make sense to, you know, beef up the road over here, or to do vegetation management to reduce the fire risk, right? And there's now an opportunity for, you know, a bit more broader interdisciplinary cross-agency thinking that I think is wonderful. You guys might be doing that already, I don't know, but I think more of that is a great thing. And I do very much support the idea that, you know, it's really important now for state and local agencies, you know, all the way down, all the way up, to think critically about what capabilities, what structures, you know, what sort of competencies, I like to say, are needed to be able to deal with these future challenges. And, you know, I think it's really important to ask, if we don't have it now, you know, what does it take to get there? And it's not simply data and models and information, right? It's about relaxing certain constraints that might have been put in place around what particular agencies do. It's about, you know, again, thinking cross agencies on these problems, right? We know that wildfires and post-fire debris flows are not traffic problems. They necessitate, you know, lots of different groups coming together to be able to think about what the solutions are. So, you know, thanks again, Lisa.
You bet. Great discussion. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Lisa, Mikhail, Kenichi. That rounds out our webinar. There's some information in the chat that includes everyone's contact information. If Mikhail or Kenichi did not get to your question, feel free to email them. So make sure you copy that portion of the chat now before it goes away. And then the last thing is that we do have one more webinar for the year coming up in a week from now on the future of public transit and shared mobility in response to COVID-19. So that should be a really exciting webinar. It includes some great research. So if you're interested in that, please feel free to sign up and register for that. With that, we will call it a day. Again, remember, in the chat are everyone's emails, so please feel free to email all of us. And thank you so much for joining us, and hope you have a safe and enjoyable holidays. Thank you so much, everyone. Take care.